Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you all here in this incredibly beautiful library, and because of President Cardoso's visit, the sun has come out, the clouds have lifted, so it's really a wonderful afternoon. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor in political science and international public affairs, and I currently serve as provost here at Brown. And on behalf of President Paxson and myself, I'd like to welcome everyone to Brown and to the John Carter Brown Library, which, as many people know, is the home to an internationally renowned, constantly growing collection of primary historical sources pertaining to the Americas. And we're delighted to be with you this afternoon for the 95th Stephen A. Ogden Memorial Lecture on International Affairs. The Ogden Lecture is one of Brown University's oldest and most distinguished lectures. Since the first Ogden Lecture in 1965, the university has welcomed heads of states, senior diplomats, elected officials, prime ministers, veteran journalists, and other policymakers and practitioners who have spoken from their personal experience about some of the most pressing matters that face our world today. The Ogden Lectures were established as a memorial to Stephen A. Ogden, a member of the Brown class of 1960, who died in 1963 from injuries sustained in an automobile accident. As a student, Stephen dreamed of promoting international peace through a career of international relations, a dream that is still shared by many, many Brown students. The international relations concentration is actually one of the most popular concentrations here on campus, but even students in other concentrations very much have this goal of promoting international peace and prosperity and justice through their work. Now, Peggy Ogden, Stephen's sister and a member of the Brown class of 1953, was unable to join us today, but we're delighted, however, that her good friend, Susan Adler Kaplan, a Brown alumna and trustee emerita, has joined us to represent the Ogden family, and I would like to ask Susan to please stand and be acknowledged. Thank you, Susan. Now, before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would also like to extend profound thanks to Brown alumnus and emeritus member of the corporation, Bill Rhodes, for his many, many contributions to Brown University, but including helping to bring President Cardoso back to campus today. Bill has been a stalwart supporter of Brown, including most recently being instrumental in establishing the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Graduate Fellowships in the social sciences at Brown University, which were celebrated early today with a number of individuals who are here with us today who have helped establish this fellowship. I would also like to acknowledge Ambassador Federico Duque Estrada Meyer, alternate ambassador of Brazil to the United Nations, as well as to Antonio Boncristiano, who serves on the Board of Overseers for the John Carter Brown Library. Thank you very much for being here today. And finally, many thanks to the library's director, Neil Safir, for hosting us today. Now, it is especially fitting that we're in such a grand and elegant space for today's talk by accomplished statesman and distinguished scholar, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Fernando Henrique Cardoso was first elected to national office in 1986 as a senator from the state of São Paulo, and 2 years later helped establish the Social Democratic Party. He served as Brazil's foreign minister and economy minister prior to his election as president in 1994. As economy minister and president, he oversaw the development and implementation of an economic stabilization program that controlled inflation, and his policy of reducing government involvement in the economy helped attract foreign investment. Now, I think it's important for people, normally when we think about stabilization, we don't equate it with poverty alleviation. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see that because of the stabilization plan that President Cardoso launched first as economy minister and then carried forward as president, president, the alleviation of poverty in Brazil really reduced. It was really dramatic, and there were all sorts of numbers that show not only reduction of poverty, but increased consumption of protein and all sorts of things. So this was a huge thing, not only for the macroeconomy, but for the day-to-day lives of individual citizens. President Cardoso concluded his second presidential term on January 1st, 2003, and I was just mentioning to President Cardoso that in 2000, I was asked to give a talk at a conference in São Paulo on, globalization and industry at the turn of the century. I mean, there were like 3 million of these conferences. And I had just published a book on employment relations in the global economy, and so they asked me to speak. But the highlight of the conference was the keynote speech, which was by President Cardoso, who, without any notes, got up and spoke for 45 minutes in the most incredibly articulate, intelligent, sophisticated arguments about what was going on in the economy and what was happening in society. And I remember trying to keep my jaw from flapping open and thinking, wow, we don't have politicians like that who can get up and give such an eloquent lecture on such an array of very important issues. And I would say that that phenomena has continued to this day. But turning to more happy subjects, President Cardoso, aside from being a gifted politician, is also an incredibly well-known and established scholar. A classic that I think so many of us read in graduate school or undergraduate, Dependency and Development in Latin America, but he's also published numerous other works in journals of sociology and political economy. He is also the author of The Accidental President of Brazil, something that I would recommend all of you to read. It's a terrific book, and Charting a New Course, The Politics of Globalization and Social Transformation. President Cardoso is also Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of São Paulo, and he has served as a visiting professor at academic centers in universities in Europe and the United States, including 5 years as professor at large right here at Brown at the Watson Institute. He has remained active since leaving the presidency and continues to contribute in meaningful ways to promote peace and justice, both in Brazil and worldwide. President Cardoso dedicates his time to an institute that he founded in São Paulo, the Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and is honorary president of the Party of Brazilian Social Democracy, otherwise known as the PSDB. His remarkable career has been an intersection, actually an interweaving of intellectual and political life. And because of that, he's had a profound impact, not just on scholarly work, on the way that we think about development in the world, but also on policy, what gifted politicians in the right time, in the right place can do to promote economic development, poverty alleviation, and peace. We are honored to have President Cardoso back on campus today. Please join me in welcoming President Cardoso, who will speak on democracy and corruption in Brazil and Latin America today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me say just to beginning that for me it's an honor and a pleasure, I have to say, to be here in the library and to hear what has been said by Professor Richard Locke, exaggerating about what I did. But anyhow, thank you very much. I'm very happy, as I said, to have the possibility to address to you. He said that I was able to speak 45 minutes without reading one paper. Well, but in Portuguese, which makes a difference. So today I will have a paper. I will try to be not excessive in using your time. But let me say that the talk of today will be not exactly what is the title of my talk, would be rather the transformations and cries of democracy, with special attention to the case of Brazil. But before dealing with the phenomenon which affects both Europe and the Americas, the cries of democracy, I used to say how grateful I am to Brown University for this opportunity and distribute the creation of these Cardoso fellowships to offer the possibility for all Brazilians to come to Brown and to discuss more in depth our problems, not just Brazilian problems, but Latin American and global problems. At the end of my term as president in the year 2002, I received many invitations to give classes and lectures in different universities. I decided to accept Brown's invitation, considering the prestige of the university and the genuine interest in promoting studies in Latin America, and specifically about Brazil. It would be maybe more easy to me to give classes in Latin America or in France, since our language is more close to my training, but my decision was to come to Brown. And I would like to recall the kindness of Ruth Simmons, then president of Brown, every time we met, as well as the steady stimulus by Bill Rhodes, one of the best supporters of Brown's academic life, he gave to me at that time and now again. In my 5 years as Brown professor at large, I had the opportunity to be in touch with Thomas Skidmore, then working in the Watson Institute, where I had an office neighbor to his office. Often we talk about the matters of common interests. I remember it with saudades. I like to remember too, among various other persons with whom I have been in touch at Brown, Professor Dietrich Huschmeyer, Patrick Heller, we're still around, Professor Richard Snyder, and James Green, an enthusiast of Brazilia's political and social affairs. Thank you very much for the way you were receiving me at the time and now again, and also the generous cooperation of several people to turn possible the creation of these fellowships. For me, it was also gratifying. The seminar organized in Brown by colleagues to commemorate the 40th anniversary of a book I wrote with Enzo Faleto, you refer to, called Dependence and Development in Latin America. The contributions by many Americans and European sociologists and political scientists commenting the book were published in 2009 in Studies in Comparative International Developments, a journal from the Watson. On top of that, I was granted by Brown a PhD honorary degree, so including me among its academic family. To culminate my gratitude, today we are celebrating the generous creation of a fellowship for Brazilian students interested in deepening their knowledge in the social science, and more specifically in programs related to Latin America and Brazil. So I thank you very much, President Christina Paxton, for the tribute and for that attendance she's coming, for the attendance of this Ogden lecture. The second I have the honor to be invited for. In the first Ogden lecture I delivered, my subject was the influence of globalization on democratic theory. Little did I knew then how profoundly globalization would impact and continues to have such a transformative impact on politics, economics, and culture across the world. Indeed, the very meaning of democracy in the contemporary world is being reframed in the light of new challenges and realities. Let me start with some considerations about the idea of democracy in America. The founding fathers of American democracy believed that the freedom of the individual was the moral foundation for associative life. Living in community was not an external imposition, but rather a need felt by the citizenry that for this very reason accepted the limitations to each one's freedom to preserve everyone's freedom. Law was, therefore, the condition of conviviality, and equality under the law stemmed from the conviction that all men are born equal, entitled to freedom, which is a natural right of each and everyone. And this was sustained when America was yet under slavery. But the founders were thinking ahead. Sovereignty, lead with the people, and law was at the same time the foundation of each person's freedom and the safeguard of everyone. Judges were the guarantor and the interpreter of the rules of conviviality and of respect in the private sphere. The Supreme Court safeguarded the rules of the democratic interplay and the spirit of freedom against any usurper, be it the legislative or the executive branch. Behind these constructions lay what Tocqueville had keenly grasped, a certain condition of equality, deriving from the coexistence between the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom, as well as from the widespread right to own land which prevailed in New England. The foundation of power in Latin America stemmed from very different sources. The difference between the North American and the Latin American situations can easily be outlined. Our political systems bear the stamp of a paradox. A huge expectation is invested in the head of state, the holder of authority. But this is contradicted by a democratic institutional architecture based on factions and particular interests alien to the logic of submission to the head of state. Elections to the president and to the Congress follow a different political logic. The former tends to produce a majority that will be invested in the head of state, which are seldom replicated in the distributions of seats in Congress. Thus, only in some rare occasions does the president find from the start a solid majority in the legislative branch, enabling him to fulfill the expectations of the people. Hence, the conflicting character of the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch that typifies Latin America presidentialism. A certain condition of equality, this component highlighted by Tocqueville as a unifying factor in American politics, withers away in Latin America under the historical burden of poverty and income concentration. Political parties reflect more than represent interests that are fragmentary, scattered all over society, and are prismatically mirrored in the legislative. These interests are not connected to values. They do not arise out of a platform capable of, using a classic expression, bring happiness to people. The machinery of democratic institutions grounds forward, but it lacks the soul, the spirit, which should nurture it. The belief in the form of equality under the law, applicable to all, the search for general interests, and the pathway to greater social equality is missing. The incompetence of governments or their inability to satisfy society's expectations, heightened by democratization itself, paved the way for the emergence of demagogues or saviors of the nation. The citizenry, if we can use this word to qualify the electoral masses, does not feel engaged in and concerned with the decisions taken by government. The consequence is the emergence of a gap between public opinion, namely the informed opinion, and the national opinion, namely the perception of the majority of the population, less connected with everyday politics, but no less aware of their immediate interests and no less politically important as they account for the majority of voters. The script and the actors may change. Yesterday, generals were responsible for the crisis. Today, this role is played by plebiscitary caudillos. Yesterday, dictatorships followed an unacceptable script. Today is government inefficiency to satisfy people's demands or generalized corruption. I am deeply convinced that without a strong advocacy for democracy and the rule of law, without a certain condition of equality, the fragmentation of societies, the excluded masses, and the clash of interests among the power elites will hardly lead to greater political stability. Another threat to democracy is related to the pervasive phenomenon of corporativism. It is indeed surprising how in presently democratic situations such as the Brazilian, Argentine, or Mexican, with repeated electoral experiences, freedom of press, and all of democratic paraphernalia, the corporative connection retain their force, while the democratic spirit remains weak. If the political parties seem fragile and the interest groups active, the corporative connections, on the contrary, remain strong. Parallel to the permanence or renewal of the forms of corporative connection in countries that have democratized themselves, there are other trends in progress, some of them rising risks to the pursuit of the democratic order. I'm obviously referring to the recent political developments in countries such as Venezuela, with regional repercussions. Many analysts see in these events a populist resurgence, but I think that there is more to it. What we are witnessing is a strengthening of authoritarian statism based on a style of political mobilization, which, in order to be grounded on more than just the charisma of the leader, tends to reinforce the corporativism in trade unions and large state-owned companies, and as well as inside the military. This indeed corresponds more closely to a relapse into the type of authoritarian corporatism and political mobilization prevalent on the 30s and 40s in the past century. Before dealing with the specific and dramatic present situation in Brazil, I would like to enlarge the scope of our analysis to embrace the widespread phenomenon of the crisis of representative democracy. At the core of this crisis is the widening gap between people's aspiration and the capacity of political institutions to respond to the demands of society. This phenomenon is neither local nor transitory. Some thinkers go as far as to speak of a paradigm shift, a civilizational change. It is one irony of our age that this depth of trust in political institutions coexists with the rise of citizens increasingly incapable of making choices that shape their lives and the future of their societies. Throughout a long period, extending from the American independence and the French Revolution to the Second World War, and its political consequence, the institutions of representative democracy gained ground in the West. Despite amazing levels of human exploitation, the progress of industrialization and urbanization gave rise to a new culture based on secularization, separation between state and religion, and individualization. Political associations emerged to give voice to different sectors of the population. Political parties are institutions born in the 19th century as properly political parties, as an organization independent from cliques already inside government. Parties became mass organizations that gave voice to different social classes. There was a correspondence between political parties and the structure of a society with class cohesion. It is this world that is being affected by the mutations that we have described as a crisis. At the core of civilizational changes are technological transformations. To keep it simple, the communication revolution and its impact in society, economics, and culture. So to give you an example, the classical distinction by the German sociologist Tönnies between community, Gemeinschaft, the locus of people's face-to-face experience with each other, and society, Gesellschaft, the kind of social organization in which people relate more formally through norms and contracts, needs to be revised. Today, the tribes formed the internet link people to each other without the intermediation of formal organizations. Like-minded communities of all kinds are created, transcending any barrier, including national frontiers. The politics of identity challenges the politics of class, contrary to previous expectations that socioeconomic difference would prevail over difference based on culture and race. The world of yesterday, based in the society of classes with the political institutions, the parties, representing different class interests and values embedded in ideologies, no longer exist as they existed before. Of course, classes are there. Of course, parts are there. But they do not have the same sense they had up to the transformation from the modern era, as I used to call, to contemporary era, which is an era produced by enormous transformations, technological transformations, including the communication revolution. The old forms of sociability and links of cohesion have been overturned by the fragmentation of society, the rise of new occupations, and intense social mobility. These profound transformations in the fabric of contemporary society led to disconnection between political system, parties, and society for one side, and the people on the other side. So it's much more generalized and profound than just a crisis in Brazil or in America or in France or in England or in I don't know where. Is something which is provoked by enormous transformation on the structure of modern contemporary society by the revolutions we are facing in our days. 20 years ago, many in the so-called South feared that globalization would increase the distance between a rich North and a poor South. Something unexpected did happen. Something completely unexpected did happen. Within each rich country, there are winners and losers of globalization. Those who feel at ease in the new global environment and those who feel victimized by force beyond their control, leading to a profound sense of personal and social loss. So I'm not referring to the fact that class disappeared, it's not that. But the point is that because of globalization, because of transformations in communication system, because of enormous transformation in the productive system, the fragmentation of society, social mobility, and so on and so forth, to some extent have turned weak the cohesion produced by the fragmentation in classes. And by consequence, turns the parties which aim at represent those classes more capable to do it. And the ideologies are much more difficult to be accepted by people because they correspond to another moment of our history. Is this phenomenon not confirmed by the overwhelming vote pro-Trump in the Rust Belt or by the pro-Brexit vote in the depressed rural industrial regions of England? Or conversely, the victory of Macron in France was not achieved with the massive support of the prosperous cities and regions which see the European Union as an asset, not as a threat? Who can deny that the working class and the union-based voters of the British Labour Party supported the Brexit in the same way that the workers who voted for the Communist Party in France migrated in large number to Marine Le Pen. What unites these voters? Old class consciousness or the new feeling of loss rather than gain with the transformations in their society? New majorities are being formed around messages and leaders who vocalize them. One narrative, Trump, Le Pen, relies on fear, anger, and hate. Another, Macron, on hope, competence, and self-confidence. This new populism, based on fear of the future, has a meaning which is quite different, quite the opposite of the Latin American populism, which was nationalistic, but wanted economic development and social inclusion. Today's populism in Europe and the United States is also nationalist, but in the sense of what I used to call a regressive utopia, the longing for the return to an idealized past. It also supports the social exclusion of minorities, immigrants, and all other kinds of people that do not conform to their moral prescriptions. So it's the opposite. If you compare the meaning of populism in Latin America with the meaning of populism nowadays in Europe or in America. And the reason why this shift occurs is because they are inscribed in a quite different global situation, which has much more accent on what will occur with me because of globalization, that with what will occur with me because of my party or my social class. In another paradox, the sum web that connects corporations, flows of capital, and technology across the globe also connects terrorist cells, launders this money, and empower cyber pirates. In a nutshell, the crisis we're now living in is simply the emergence of the contemporary society that is driving away the modern society. Of the world of yesterday, we only see the ruins. Of the emerging world, only the shadows. This overall process of change affects Latin American society, but there are some specifics. Many of our countries, after getting rid of the military regimes of the Cold War, tried to rebuild pre-existing democratic forms whose structure reflected societies which were oligarchic. In some cases, there was a kind of fusion between previous democratic forms and populism supported by the many who want a place in the sun and the urban industrial society. In other countries, the relatively small number of those demanding access to modernity, mainly to universal social services provided by governments, facilitated the establishment of a democratic rule in the European and American traditions. Countries with large populations and those more affected by populism had much greater difficulty to make this adjustment. All, however, suffered the effects of what I call the rise of the contemporary society and of globalization. At this point, and in order not to speak beyond a reasonable time, I return to the case of Brazil. In our country, as in several others, the overall crisis of politics is enhanced by a moral crisis arising out of the disclosure of a widespread system of corruption. First, a statement. Today's collapse is the result of the persistence of a political culture based on patronage and corporatism at the moment in which countries are making the transition from modernity to contemporaneity. People live today at a time of universal access to information and connection through the webs of communication. Patterns of electoral behavior and power mechanisms that were traditionally accepted now appear as dissonant and intolerable. An informed public opinion is now aware of the evidence of corruption at a systematic level. The institutional framework of the Brazilian democracy was established by the Constitution of 1998, a landmark in the transition to the rule of law. The Constitution incorporated several inconsistencies in the economic sphere while affirming political and civic rights, including in the social sphere. It granted full freedom for the organization of political parties and ensured their partial public financing, allowing private finance to give support to parties. This became an incentive to the aggregation of deputies and persons forming fake parties. The President of the Republic is elected by an absolute majority of at least 50% plus one vote. If not in the first term, second term. With 28 political parties represented nowadays in Parliament, the parties of elected presidents never got more than 20% of the seats in the Parliament. The situation made it an imperative the formation of parliamentary alliances in order to govern in a kind of presidentialist coalition system. This is not a choice, this is an imposition. The Constitution says clearly the president has to have 50% plus one. Population looks after the president as the hero. The guy has vote, the guy has power. He will solve my problem. In practice, the president has to face the parliament and have to send bills to the parliament. And in parliament, never, since the Constitution of '88, never. The majority, the party who elect the president had more than 20% of the seats of the parliament. So how to govern? Well, it's not a matter of choice to make alliance. It's an imposition. You are in a democracy. The Congress has to approve bills. How to get approval if the presidential party has not the majority alone? He has to make alliances. The situation, in today, even adding the seats of the three main parties, the PT, PMDB, and PSDB, and they hardly join forces, today, these three main parties account for 180 out of 513 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. Today is like that. PT, which has, I don't know exactly how many, 58 candidates, representatives. PMDB, 56, PSDB, 66, 56. Altogether, they are approximately 180. But they are against each other. So how to govern? How to form a majority? How to deliver what is expected by people? The executive branch depends on a parliamentary majority to legislate. Consequently, the parliamentary base of support for any government can only be achieved through alliance between parties. Given the persistence of the patterns of patronage and corporatism, complacent, to say the least, with favor and privilege, the executive builds political alliance by sharing power through the nomination of politicians to public functions in the state and in public companies. In my government, parliamentary majority could be established with 3 or 4 large parties, united at least formally in their support to the presidential candidates program before the election. But you had, at the time, maybe 10 parties. Today, you have 28. And the line waiting for the approval is composed by 30 additional parties. Altogether, it will be, 58 parties. So how to form a majority in that case? Even a fake-based program majority is extremely difficult. Lula's election, when President Lula was elected, and he got the same situation, around 20% of the seats belonging to the working class party, the rest was other parties. But when Lula was elected, it coincided with 2 independent and positive developments. The first was the presentation prior to the election of a letter to the Brazilian people in which Lula assumed the engagement to follow the basic principles of the previous government in economic and financial matters: floating exchange rates, a system of targets to control inflation, and compliance with the law of fiscal responsibility, which imposes limits to the expansion of the public spending. Let me tell you one very short story. This law has been approved, I guess, around the year 2000, to my surprise, because it's a very, very, very hard decision to impose limits and even to transform into crime as far as the president or the governor is not following what is described by law, is a crime. Well, the Congress approved it, to my surprise, without any big discussion. Why? Because they never believed, in fact, that the legislation would be implemented. The same occur with the agencies. I decided a long time ago, when we were privatizing, the privatization was not my idea, it was a law based on our previous periods during President Sarney's government. We had to privatize if we go to privatize, it's necessary to create an agency to take care of the process after privatization. Who will be responsible for the contract? To what extent the government will follow the tariffs already decided? To what extent the new companies will comply with targets proposed during the privatization program? So we create agencies. The agencies have been appointed by the president with the senatorial approval, of course. Well, at the beginning, the political party had no idea about the importance of those agencies. I was absolutely free to appoint whoever I decide, of course, depending on the advice of my minister, in the oil agency, energy agency, so on and so forth. Then the Congress realized that the agencies have power. So nowadays, the appointment for the agencies is also included in the bargaining system. How many seats you have, my party, you have in this or that agency. So this is the situation that Lula at the beginning was in agreement, but it was impossible for him to implement the agreement because the political pressure was very high, and without majority it's impossible. The second important and consequent development under Lula was the fact that the terms of interchange in international commerce evolved in favor of the commodities producing countries. This was very obvious because of China mainly. The commodities price went up. A long time ago, I was working at the Economic Commission for Latin America, which was an important institution in the region tied to the United Nations, under the leadership of an Argentinian Raúl Prebisch economist. And the main idea was, well, it's impossible to develop because the developing countries are producing industrialized goods, and we are producing raw material, so commodities. And the prices are always in favor of industrialized goods, not commodities. Well, after China, it was the reverse. So the Brazilian situation changes a lot altogether. Well, this produced an enormous acceleration in the economic growth and also high levels of investment, and the acceleration of social inclusion, which was already improving, but Lula expanded considerably the social inclusion. Then Lula's party chose to focus on strengthening its base of support inside and outside Congress. In so doing, it opened the door for the state to a large and heterogeneous conglomerate of political parties, big and small, rightists or leftists, and it also ensured the access to state funds to provide corporations arbitrarily designated as national champions. This was a situation, a de facto situation. I'm not blaming the political leader, the situation evolved in that direction. As far as the fragmentation was occurring, as far as the government decided to enlarge social and political bases, the number of pressures increased enormously in the whole political system. Sooner or later, maybe sooner rather than later, politicians realized the advantages of creating new parties, no matter how small in size or vague in ideas. By creating new parties, they start to participate in the sharing power. And sharing power means also sharing the consequence of power, and including financial consequence of power. The first big corruption scandal, the so-called Mensalão, erupted in the midst of Lula's first term. A congressman denounced that dozens of members of parliament were receiving on a monthly basis illegal financial contributions to support the government. Well, this was the turning point, the beginning of a new phase, that of the presidential system by co-option. So we are passing from a presidential system of coalition to another one, which is a presidential system of co-option. What is the difference? Coalition, anyhow, at least in the imagination, we have a basis for how to aggregate parties. I have a proposal, a set of targets. The set of targets has at least formally approved. In the cooptation system, that's not the discussion. When Mensalão started, it was a surprise, because some people are receiving on a monthly basis money to support government. Well, not yet a widespread system, some case. I will refer later on to the fact. Well, and then, for sure, corruption in Brazil is an ancient practice. Nominations for government spots in exchange for political support, also. This is not new. We had always some types of corruption and nominations to have support. However, the misdeeds in the past were either individual acts or a mix of patronage with leniency, not a fundamental mechanism for a government to gain and retain power. What the transformation from Mensalão into Petrolão is exactly that. Mensalão was not yet a mechanism to retain power, to approve bills, but not to retain power and to repeat new gains. Those practices reached an all-encompassing level 10 years later after Mensalão with the so-called Petrolão. The scandal initially centered on Petrobras. Well, over the last 2 years, the Operação Lava Jato, car wash, led by the federal police and the judiciary, gradually disclosed the systemic nature of corruption in Brazil. The consequences for the political institution and moral fabric of the country are overwhelming. The truth is that even oppositional parties, at the end of the day, were involved in similar practices. Although having less or no power, the illicitude was more linked to non-registered electoral private financing than deviation of public money to be used in political campaigns and eventually personal corruption. This endeavor was facilitated by the expansion of the economy and the fraudulent manipulation of state funds. The government ensured a steady supply of cheap public credit to national companies investing in Latin America, Africa, and even globally. This creates a web of complicity between important sectors of the Brazilian economy and the parties in power. This interconnection, not to say connivancy, between public and private interests was by and large accepted by society. That is the reality, that is true. We were changing step by step from a more traditional system in which corruption existed, in which nomination for positions in power existed, toward another one in which the base for gain and retain power was based on that. And instead of having personal misbehavior, we have an official misbehavior by accepting the system and by appointing people to positions in government and in public agency, as Petrobras, to connect employees with business people and parties. So it was a complete transformation, maybe, of something that has been kind of seed long time ago, but at the end became a quite complicated system based in these bad practices. The proliferation of political parties, the transformation of electoral campaigns in a costly show business, the personal corruption of some political agents, the complicity of public and private companies ultimately led to the endless series of scandals denounced by the judiciary and the media. Some argue that the use of slush fund and undercover second cash account to finance electoral campaigns was a common practice. Common, perhaps, but certainly not generalized. What is new is not only the amount of funds received, but both as campaign donations and as money illegally diverted from contracts with the public sector. What is new is the dissemination of this system throughout the public sector and the involvement of top members of the federal government in its organization and spread. Connected and informed, but not necessarily reflexive people perceive parties and politicians as being all involved with corruption and responsible for the inefficiency of public services. This gives rise to an overall reaction of indignation and, more often than not, an attitude of cynicism regarding public life. The moral question, which seemed to be a concern of the educated middle class, has now become a concern of the people at large. So we have, of course, a similar crisis in terms of representative democracy comparing to what occurs in other parts of the world. But we have some specificities because we have this moral crisis, which comes together with the lack of trust on the capacity of parties to represent people, which is generalized. But we have an additional point. It's not just that, but those who are in power and those who are politicians, being in power or not, are members of the so-called political class. And the political class is not untrustful, but is also corrupt. That is the perception by people. Well, it's time. I'm not blaming one person or another person. I'm trying to describe a system. How was it possible to evolve in such a way? It is time to conclude. The moment we are living should not be understood as a trend. It reflects the prevalency of contemporaneity. As such, I trust that interconnection between access to information and the demands for transparency and accountability will probably lead to substantive improvements in our democratic experience. Brazilian institutions have proved their resiliency. The federal police, the federal public ministry, the judiciary are acting with the autonomy and independence granted by the Constitution. I never could imagine myself to praise the federal police. But it's true that the federal police is behaving in conformity with the Constitution. Younger judges and prosecutors, many graduated abroad, namely in American universities, have greater familiarity with Anglo-Saxon law, often in conflict with our German law tradition. They are well equipped to use legal dispositions such as the plea bargain to foster their investigations. Brazil is a signatory of the international conventions to fight organized crime, especially tax evasion and money laundering. The exchange of information with other countries has also helped to disclose crimes of corruption and bribery that in the past would have remained undetected. In the past, let me give one more example of how things have changed for the best despite the complexity of the present crisis. In the past, confronted with a crisis such as the current one, we, Brazilians, would be speculating about the attitude of the 4-star generals, members of the High Command. Today, most of us do not even know their names, but we know the names of the 11 justices of the Supreme Court. They are household names. The Supreme Court, as a guardian of the Constitution, has the final decision. It decides, and that's it, even if by pressure of Congress or the public opinion, it has later on to modify his decision. The means of communication, mainstream and social media, are fulfilling their role. They anticipate what is going to happen. They criticize any and all acts of corruption or threats to the democratic process. Of course, those who are in power don't like that. When I was in office, it's enough to read my diaries. I was furious against the press all the time. Not necessarily because they were correct, but they are anyhow trying to do what they have to do. That is to say, to anticipate. Even if they don't know exactly, they try to perceive signals of danger, and they denounce. Of course, those who are affected by denounce, well, for me, for the other, it's not correct, I don't know what, I did not that. Okay, I understand. But as an institution, I think that what is going on is correct. To say the media are trying to correspond to what we expect from them from a constitutional point of view. The media exercise its critical independence with an essential, which is essential to the preservation of democratic values and of climate of freedom. The point is, and let me end with that, the algorithm of politics has changed. I don't know exactly what is the meaning of algorithm, but I use all the time a small computer in my hand, and I know that there are algorithms behind. Well, it's what is occurring with the political life. The algorithm of politics has changed. It is time to reweave the threads between society and politics, citizen action and representative democracy. To be a little bit more pedantic, demos and res publica. That is the question. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So in my introduction, you can hear me, right? Okay. In the introduction, I talked about the brilliant lecture that I heard, what was it, maybe 17 years ago? That time in Portuguese, this time in English, in terms of that President Cardoso is clearly very capable, even in his non-native tongue, to speak in such an intelligent and articulate way. So I guess I thought I would ask a couple questions just to start us off, and then we can open it up for question and answers. So having just heard this incredible lecture on the tension between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, between class and identity politics, between the unintended consequences of electoral system, design party systems, and how it led to this algorithm of maybe unethical politics. I guess my first question is, how do you think your role as a scholar has impacted your career as a political leader?
Well, I think that being by training a scholar, even when I was an officer or a member of the parliament, I tried to be, not to let me be totally involved in the day-by-day politics, trying to have some distance to analyze what's going on. And it helped me a lot to be a little bit more analytical than just a political man. Of course, I cannot be all time analytical, otherwise I would be impossible to be elected. You have to be emotional, you have to have emotion, to transmit emotion, so on and so forth, and have position, you have to take position. But anyhow, behind that, it's important to try to understand what's going on. What I'm trying to understand here now, what's happening in democracy. It's more complicated than we believe. It's not just the lack of morality. It's that you are changing the way how society works and is organized. What you said in terms of terms or another social scientist. So I think it's important to try to understand. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have to try to understand. On the other hand, because of my training as sociologist, I was trained as sociologist making research. And my first books were about blacks, slavery, and also blacks and prejudice. So I visited what we used to call at the time favelas. Now we call communities. See? And now back again, because of my involvement in renewing of the drug policies in Brazil and globally, I went to the communities again. Well, I was trained to talk to people. And to listen to people. When I start my political life, people in opposition tried to discredit me by saying, wow, he's an intellectual. So he speaks more easily French than Portuguese. Never saw a poor person but in Paris. This kind of thing. This was a complete lack of knowledge about how was my training, my experience. And I learned, but being a sociologist, that you have to listen. For instance, several colleagues from the university, when I became senator, they are, I don't know why are you capable to live with these people. These people are the senators or the Congress people, but they consider bad people. Well, they represent Brazil, so I have to understand what they express. And I was highly influenced by a professor from the engineering, faculty of engineering in São Paulo, who used to say, well, the point is not people, immoral people, it's stupid people. Because the immoral one day, the other day maybe not, stupid is always. So I took this very seriously. So everyone which approached me, I tried to understand why the guy asking me this question. Is it possible for me to correspond to what he wants or not? What are the reasons? So a sociological look did help me a lot. Maybe, I don't know, if this is not necessary. There are other forms to understand the political life, but in my case, it was like that.
Great, thanks. Let me ask one other question, which has to do with the point that you raised at the beginning of your talk about the role of technology. And the argument, if I understood that, was that changing technology, especially social media, was kind of changing the concept of community, creating less cohesion and more division and cleavage. But I wonder, can you see a pathway where the same technology, the same social media, can actually reverse the trend, could maybe create new forms of cohesion, new forms of community, and likewise, and I know this is something that was promoted under your government, that these forms of technology can lead to greater transparency and hence less corruption. I remember under your government that one could go and look at actually the public spending, even at the local level, for healthcare to see, are they actually spending the budget that was allocated to them? So the way you presented it sounded like we were in a secular trend that was divisive. Can it actually be used to reverse that trend?
I try to conclude today by saying, well, in spite of all, because of new technologies, because of the new training, prosecutors, lawyers, judges are more competent in revealing corruption. See, and on top of that, everyone knows what's going on. This is rather a positive outcome of the new technologies. The new technologies are not necessarily bad. They are also producing good results. See, I don't know how it will be in the future. Is the future, we'll never know. But anyhow, since the parties are becoming more limited, paralyzed because of what I said, everyone knows. On the other hand, since the population is capable to behave, and from time to time, even to demonstrate, to go into the street and to protest or to ask for, so on and so forth. This is a part of reality. Wow. And the parts are becoming more weak. How to govern? This is a question mark. I don't know. I don't know if I remember 30 or 40 years ago, it was very fashionable to debate about the form of the party as a form. Remember, the French people have La Forme Parti.
Especially the French people.
All the time, we're discussing it. So now I don't know if the party, like a format, will correspond to the political organization in the future. I'll give you a simple example. If someone approached me and asked me can I be inscribed in your party? I have doubts. Why? Because what is the meaning of being inscribed in a party in Brazil concretely? What this guy will do? We will attend a meeting to discuss what? Probably local, internal debate. Who will be the president of the committee or I don't know what. And if people want to be involved in causes, which are quite different, or the parties are not being capable to transform the day-by-day life of the party members into something with meaning in modern world. I had a friend in France, he died, was prime minister. And this guy wrote a book about his life. And his life was entirely within the Socialist Party. So the Socialist Party was capable to offer a way of life. Because the seminars were there, the feasts were there. If I want to marry, it's in the party. If I have the party was a lively organization. We know more. So I don't know exactly how government will relate to the point that the population is putting pressure through other instruments. It will be possible to have a more flexible kind of government, more capable to listen to people. So it's not clear. That's why I refer to crisis in representative democracy. If you are speaking about China or, I don't know, Turkey, they don't have this type of crisis because they have another culture. Another culture could be even more efficient in delivering results for people, but without freedom and without existing the linkage out of the party of the state system. So it's a different kind. But we are living another way, other world. In our world, we don't know exactly how to manage the situation. I don't know. No. If you know, please tell me.
Alas, no. Let me just follow up briefly. When you described the system and the evolution of the political system in Brazil, which I thought was really, really fascinating, and basically how the Constitution led to a certain structure of elections and parties. And then the search for an economic basis for these parties, which led to this incredible system of corruption with parastatals, private companies, et cetera. It reminded me tremendously of the Prima Repubblica in Italy, which it got exposed by judges, et cetera. And while everyone thought there would be reform, it ended up leading to Berlusconi.
Yes.
In today's New York Times, there was a whole article, I think it was today's, maybe it was yesterday's, about the possibility of a Berlusconi-like politician emerging in Brazil. How do we make sure it leads to the kinds of reforms that you talk about as opposed to what we've seen in so many other countries?
There is a serious debate in Brazil, including by the judges who are pushing ahead the car wash operation, others, because they are comparing, they know what happened in Italy, everyone knows the consequences in terms of Berlusconi, and if you look the Brazilian current day situation, I cannot say to you this is not possible. It's not possible, because but this is not just the case of Brazil. Why? as I said here, in our days, messages have a strong influence on people's behavior, more than social cohesion, because social cohesion is weak. So it is a dangerous situation. I don't want to go into details, but you had Trump in America. Well, it would be not thinkable some time ago, not because of the way he is, but because he broke the establishment. See? So establishment can be more easily broken by the new technology of people's connection, not necessarily the bad. I said Macron. Macron did the opposite in the case of globalization. But it will depend to a large extent on the capacity of someone to express one sentiment in coincidence with people's aspirations. And this is risky. First of all, it depends, is this or not a person capable to do that? Secondly, is this person committed to the Constitution, the enforcement of laws, human rights? In our case, I don't want to go into specificities, but there are someone who are really from the right side, are really risky people. One of the candidates, when I was in office, proposed to kill me. I didn't pay attention. Well, I'm alive. But anyhow, today I am a friend because he has power now. No, not yet. He possibility of having power. So I think it is important for those who believe that you have to keep some basic constitutional rights and freedom, liberty, democracy, so on and so forth, to organize and to resist, to propose a more sensible message to people. But this is a political construction. We cannot have in political science we can predict the past, but in politics we never can predict the future. It depends on people, depends on the capacity, because it depends on emotion, not just on the reason. Depends of emotion, and we don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure. In our case, if someone will be capable, or maybe those who are capable maybe don't correspond to what I would like to see as head of state. Yeah. Great. So it's an embarrassing situation, no doubts about it.
For all of us. Why don't we open it up for questions? And are there microphones? So there are microphones on the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated and we will come to you.
Okay. So we have right here, Amy. Introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, my name is Amy Nunn, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Public Health. And I want to thank you because you wrote the foreword to my book about AIDS in Brazil about 8 years ago.
Please speak more direct to the microphone.
Okay.
Like a political man, like that.
Normally I'm loud and no one has trouble hearing me, but I'll try to speak up. I wanted to say thank you. My name is Amy Nunn. I'm an associate professor at the School of Public Health, and you wrote the foreword to my book about AIDS in Brazil about 8 years ago, so I'm delighted to meet you in person. My question is, of course, about public health. How do you see the future of the public health infrastructure being affected by the current political crisis in Brazil? I know I follow the HIV work closely because that's my field, but I'd be interested in your perspective about that, about access to medicines in Brazil, but also about the broader SUS system.
I don't know if you got the question.
The question was about the update of the situation in public health in Brazil.
Oh, yes. Well, I have maybe a personal view, not with information about what you asked me on health. I think that the health system in Brazil evolved more positively than the educational system. If you ask people in surveys, they will say the opposite. Health situation is a situation of despair, and they will not pay too much attention to education. Why? Because the Constitution created the SUS, Unique Systems of Health. Well, before, we had nothing. So we had only the corporations had some health system, some corporations. Well, in nowadays, everyone is entitled, at least entitled, to receive treatment, in some cases by free. even very complicated system. Is it good? No, not good. But we had not zero, and now we have something. We create a complicated system in Brazil, which put together the public and the private, not on a free base by law. Anyhow, but it works. Let us be a little bit demagogue. So only a little bit. I used to be attended by the SUS. That is to say, I go to a hospital which belongs to the public system of health. I did when I was president, either using the Armed Forces Hospital or in São Paulo, a hospital linked to the public service. Of course, in my case, they will treat me better, I hope. But anyhow, the bed is the same, the linge is the same, the nurses are the same. So it's not dramatic. So, it's possible. Of course, you have a tremendous problem. Health costs enormously. It's very expensive. Who will respond for that? So we have the middle-class groups in Brazil prefer to go private. Social security system they have. And there is in some cases, the social security, private social security system send people to the official one. It costs there are lots of questions. But I would say we are making some progress. The result is very simple to read. Life expectancy, infant mortality, all these have been positive in the last 30 years in Brazil, after the Constitution. All these have been positive. It's good? No, it's not good, but it's better. It's better off if you compare with the past. So that's my sense. I'm not an expert. This is my sense.
Okay, there's a question back here.
Okay, so my name is Rodrigo Fonseca. I'm a professor in computer science. I'm also from Belo Horizonte. So thank you for coming, for speaking. So I wanted to expand Richard's question a little bit on, so the Constitution, according to your talk, created some rules for the political game that made the game derail and devolve into this system that has all this corruption and the party system is fragmented and so forth. So my question is simple, just for basically for me to understand better. What would be a better set of rules? Or what should the political system be to produce a better outcome and not devolve into this rigged game?
Yes. Well, just say it's a very complex question. See, well, in my case, or in the case of, well, I think that it would be better to have a more districts, more narrow districts. You see, and maybe I prefer the German system because of minorities to represent together minorities too, but anyhow, about more in terms of size, in order to give to the electorate a real sense of whom are they voting. Take our system is maybe one of the worst. Is proportional uninominal. That is a bad word to say. Proportional uninominal. What is the sense of that? Take the state of São Paulo, where São Paulo has 70 representatives by the Constitution. This has been already something bad because there is no correspondence between the number of voters and the number of seats. It was a decision, a political decision to the benefits of the smaller provinces, because the smaller provinces were more easily controlled by governments. So, but anyhow, São Paulo has 70. Well, by law, each party is allowed to present the number of seats plus 1/3. To simplify, 100 candidates, every party. We have 28 parties in Congress. Suppose not 28, but 10 parties. 10 multiplied by 100, you have 1,000. If you have more than that, you have 2,000 candidates. The candidates will compete each other inside their own party and in a whole composed by, I don't know, 30 million of electors who are the electors really in Brazil in that situation? It's not the citizen. It's the intermediate organization who is able to collect votes. Who are those associates? Churches, football clubs, mayors, local power. These are the real electors. When the representative is in Brasilia, behaving as a representative, he is representing those who really are able to join vote for him. That's the situation. It's not common people. The common people has nothing to do with our system of representation. You see? Well, so I would prefer to have a smaller number of voters competing with this smaller number of parties. This is feasible, but when we wrote the Constitution, and I'm also responsible, I was co-author of the Constitution, I was deputy rapporteur of the Constitution. Well, our idea was, well, we are under a under a military regime. We hated every restriction. So we inscribed in the Constitution that the parties are free. Every time the Congress approved some restrictions, Supreme Court said, no, this is impossible. So we have an enormous amount of parties, which are not really parties, as I said, are aggregate of people interested in bargaining with the executive branch. So we have a fake democracy, even in terms of strict forms of political, of electoral system and participation. There are several other possibilities to turn the system more authentic, more in correspondence with people's will, or people awareness at least. But it's a complex matter.
Great. Other questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you, President Cardoso. I'm Mateus. Eu sou de Manaus. I'm from Manaus, Brazil. I study electrical engineering here at Brown. And my question is, we talk a lot about how systemic corruption and inefficiencies are bad. And usually the only thing we can do is to watch the federal police and the Supreme Court do their job. How can we be more active about about making our institutions better as members of civil society? Are there any tangible actions you believe we can address right now?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised because you said you are from Manaus. My mother too was from Manaus. Manaus is not that far away. Anyhow, well, there are, the complexity of the electoral politics is is enormous. So it's difficult for common people to understand all the consequences of decisions. All these require some filters, but it's possible to transmit in a more clear way. There are several institutions in Brazil trying to produce a better result in political life, several. There are several groups, NGOs acting in that sense. The parts are out. The parts are discussing inside the Congress, but there are several institutions in Brazil trying to make good proposals. There is one institution which is quite interesting. You have the popular legislation. It's for people. I don't know how many people. There are some numbers. Have the right to present to the Congress a bill. This has been done in one important case of so-called ficha suja. That is to say, someone, if he is condemned twice, cannot be candidate anymore. It was approval. It was a popular initiative. So there are instruments. As in all big countries, you are living in America, you come from Brazil. We are big countries. This is good and also bad. Everything is much complicated. It's very complicated. You have different views, different to persuade people about, but there are instruments. And now social media, which we referred before, is another instrument. The social media is discussing this kind of thing. Several groups are trying to make ahead proposals to transform our legislation, our electoral system in a better system. You see, as I said, what prevented some step ahead in the case of the party system was the Constitution. And the interpretation by the Constitution, by the Supreme Court of the Constitution, saying, well, we cannot put any restriction. If we cannot put any restriction, it's a chaos in which we are. And in the chaos, who are the benefactors of the chaos, or who take the benefits from the chaos? Those who have power. So they know, they have a lawyer, they know how to manage. So, but anyhow, I think it's possible. On the other hand, you asked me about, or someone asked me about the Italian case, etc., etc. This is always possible. But anyhow, we are discussing a lot in Brazil. If you read the newspapers, if you read the political scientists, you read the speech in parliament, the discussion is there. So I'm not pessimistic in the sense that you are becoming more aware of the difficulties. I remember other times, very bad, under Vargas, when he had a dictatorship at one point in time, or under the military. It's not the same. You have opportunities. So the point is we have to organize ourselves. And final response to you, it depends largely on leadership. It is a kind of paradox. Our society is fragmented. Everyone feels responsible for its behavior as a citizen. But it's necessary to have leadership. Mainly if the society goes more and more in the direction of multiplicity of people behaving together, we need the direction. Who is able to? But that's why the verb is so important. Again, when we had a society organized by a party, look China, the leader is an expression of these internal decisions. But that's not our case. The leaders have an important role to play. Maybe you could go back to Manaus and propose a renovation there. I will support you.
I think we have time for one last question. How about way back there?
Hi, my name is Iman, and I'm from Brasilia, Brazil. And my question is about a very current event in Brazil, which was the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff last year. And so during the impeachment process, what many people were arguing is that the impeachment was necessary because it would bring about political and economic stability to Brazil. And people were going to the streets and protesting, and they were saying that once Dilma and the Workers' Party were out of power, corruption would finally disappear from Brazil. And now, a year after the impeachment, we see that that's really not what happened because, you know, corruption scandals are still every day in the news, and Michel Temer has been implementing some very controversial reforms. And so, in the end, what I want to know is if you think that the results of the impeachment were somehow counterproductive, because it didn't really bring like any political stability, and just how you see the results of it now.
Great.
Well, let me say to you very openly and frankly about the impeachment, which is your main question. What's that? Why the impeachment? Well, in our system, which is a presidential system, every time the system stops to deliver, something has occurred. And it is dramatic, because the only way is through impeachment. And impeachment is dramatic, because you have to eliminate from power someone who receives votes, and to put there someone who also receives votes, but nobody knows, the vice president. So when I was senator, President Collor was impeached. Hopefully, I don't know, in America it's similar. As far as the House of Representatives start an impeachment process, the president ceases and is replaced by the vice president. So when Collor's impeachment start, President Itamar Franco became president, and I became foreign minister. So I was out of the Congress, Senate. I had I was not involved in the debate or in the vote, but I follow step by step. It's dramatic. The same applies now. I have been with Collor. I remember I was still in Senate, and some people Eduardo Suplicy from the PT was pressing me to sign the demand for impeachment, and I resisted to sign the demand. The same occurred with Ulisses Guimarães, the head of the opposition. We were very cautious in signing. I decided to sign only when the brother of the president related very serious crimes. So in that case, there is no more possibility. Let's sign. Because I knew, well, what is an impeachment? Is to put aside someone who will vote. Well, now again, I was very reluctant with respect to Dilma Rousseff to not to sign because I have no more power, but anyhow to speak in favor of the impeachment. Up to the point it was the government started to paralyze. I saw that with another president, Goulart, and it was coup d'état occurred because the government has to lose its capacity to govern. So it began to be paralyzed. So something has to be done. And what has to be done in a presidential system is dramatic because it's an impeachment. Of course, the impeachment requires some legal basis. And there are legal bases. In the case of Dilma was the lack several times persistently of the fiscal responsibility law. This is not a personal crime. I gave you another example. Collor was impeached on the basis of the fact that he received a gift consisted in a small car. He received a gift. The Senate decided this is the lack of decor. That is to say, how to say this? Decorum. Well, okay. When this occurred, the head of the Senate, by law, by constitution, is the head of the Supreme Court. So this guy was there during the discussion, and the Senate decided that Collor out of power, and then someone went to the Supreme Court because of a crime. He received a gift. The decision was 3-2, including in the 3, the same one who was president of Senate temporarily, saying, no, this is not a crime. It would be a crime if, in receiving the car, he gave something to the person who gave him a car. But that was not the truth. So he was not condemned by the Senate. So there is a confusion. Impeachment has not the meaning that someone made a crime, has a penalty. Is another thing. Or it was the lack of, I don't know, trust or something like that. So that is the situation. It's dramatic, it's difficult, and the consequences are extremely difficult to digest because the vice president normally has not the same characteristics of the president. So it's dramatic, but this was what occurred. Had no possibility. The government started to be paralyzed. Of course, there was a clear, the decision to non-corresponding to the fiscal responsibility law. Is this a tremendous crime? No, several people did. And then why not? Because these people were not in pole position, in power, and the consequences were not to stop the decision-making process. It's a political question. With a legal basis, but it's a political question. So that's I would prefer not to be forced to vote, as I escaped twice. Because of that, I know that it's difficult. But what to do if the government is paralyzed? You have to solve. I think this was in true what occurred in Brazil.
We've come to the end of this part of our evening. Please join me in thanking President Cardoso for a really terrific lecture. And on behalf of Brown University, I'd like to offer this small token of our appreciation, which is basically a synthesis of all the Brazilian books in this library.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.